Joel Osteen has one of the most recognizable smiles in America. For more than 2 decades, he has stood on a stage that used to belong to an NBA team, telling millions of people that better days are ahead, that they are blessed, that they are more than enough. His books have sold in the tens of millions. His sermons are broadcast into more countries than most world leaders ever visit. And yet, in the last few years, something has shifted. The headlines about Joel Osteen are no longer just about record attendance and bestseller lists. They are about federal loans, about locked doors during a hurricane, about a gunfight inside his own church, and about a generation of young Americans who are simply walking away from the kind of faith he built his empire on. So today we are going to look at the man behind the smile, how he got here, why so many people love him, why so many others distrust him, and why, right now, things are not looking good for Joel Osteen. To understand where Osteen is today, you have to go back to where he came from, because his story did not start with fame. It started in the shadow of his father. Joel Osteen was born on March 5, 1963, in Houston, Texas, the 5th of 6 children in a family completely built around church life. His father, John Osteen, had once been a Southern Baptist preacher, but a life-changing event pushed him in a different direction. When Joel's older sister Lisa was born with a severe disability, John and his wife Dodie turned toward faith healing and a more charismatic style of Christianity. That shift led them, in 1959, to found a small congregation in a rundown feed store on the east side of Houston. They called it Lakewood Church. It held fewer than 250 people. Nobody watching that tiny gathering could have imagined what it would eventually become. By the time Joel was a teenager, Lakewood had already grown into a church of several thousand people, and John Osteen had become a respected voice in Houston's religious community. Joel, though, was not interested in being the man on stage. He was the quiet kid, the one who preferred working behind the cameras to standing in front of them. After finishing high school, he enrolled at Oral Roberts University to study radio and television, but he dropped out after less than a year. College wasn't calling him. His father's ministry was. At 19 years old, in 1982, Joel Osteen went home to Houston and started building Lakewood's television broadcast from scratch. For the next 17 years, that was his entire world. He produced the services, edited the footage, picked the camera angles, and even paid attention to details like what suit his father wore on air. He wanted every broadcast to look as polished as anything you'd see on a major network. Along the way, without ever taking a single class in theology, he absorbed thousands of hours of his father's preaching. He was learning to build sermons the same way an editor learns to build a movie, one cut at a time. For nearly 2 decades, Joel refused every invitation his father gave him to step up and preach. His answer was almost always the same: "You're the preacher, I'll make you look good on television." Then, in January 1999, that finally changed. On January 17th, Joel delivered his very first sermon at Lakewood. 6 days later, his father died suddenly of a heart attack. The first sermon Joel ever gave turned out to be the last one his father would ever hear. Almost overnight, a man with no formal training in ministry and 17 years of experience behind a camera was thrust into leading a congregation of roughly 6,000 members. Nobody, including Joel himself, expected it to work. But it did work, and it worked fast. Within 5 years, weekly attendance at Lakewood exploded from around 8,000 people to somewhere between 25 and 30,000, making it the largest church in the country. Joel didn't just get lucky. He applied everything he had learned as a television producer to growing the ministry. He doubled the church's advertising budget, bought prime broadcast slots in major cities, and put Lakewood's name on billboards across Houston. But the biggest reason people kept coming back wasn't the marketing. It was the message. Joel wasn't preaching about hellfire or sin. He was preaching about hope, about believing in yourself, about trusting that God had good things planned for your life. People who had never set foot in a church before found themselves tuning in, and staying. The building itself could no longer keep up with the crowds, so in 2003 Lakewood made a move that stunned the city of Houston. The church signed a lease to take over the Compaq Center, the former home of the Houston Rockets, a 16,000-seat arena. The lease was worth $12 million over 30 years, with an option to extend for another 30 years at $22 million. Then came the renovation, which cost the church roughly $95 million, equivalent to well over $150 million today. Crews spent 15 months gutting the old sports arena and rebuilding it with 5 new floors, waterfalls, broadcast studios, classrooms, and hundreds of thousands of square feet of new space. When the doors opened on July 16, 2005, all 16,000 seats were filled, and millions more watched on television. A basketball arena where fans once cheered for the Rockets had become one of the largest churches in America. In 2010, Lakewood bought the building outright for $7.5 million. From there, the growth almost seemed limitless. Weekly attendance climbed past 40,000 people, and the television broadcast reportedly reached into more than 90% of American households, with an estimated 10 million viewers a week across more than 100 countries. Joel became a publishing phenomenon too. His first book, Your Best Life Now, came out in October 2004 and sold 500,000 copies in just 3 months. Within a year it had sold over 1 million, and it stayed on the New York Times bestseller list for roughly 4 years straight, eventually selling more than 4 million copies worldwide. He went on to write more than a dozen additional books, several of which also became bestsellers, and he built out a business empire around his ministry that included arena tours, a satellite radio channel, and a massive social media following that today numbers in the tens of millions across different platforms. He sat down with Oprah, appeared on Larry King Live, and became a regular presence on mainstream morning shows, reaching an audience that had nothing to do with traditional church-going. His wife, Victoria, whom he met in 1985 when she helped him replace a watch battery at her family's jewelry store, became just as prominent, launching Lakewood's women's ministry and becoming a best-selling author herself. Their 2 children, Jonathan and Alexandra, grew up performing and eventually preaching in front of tens of thousands of people, continuing the family business into a second generation. By almost any measure you could apply to a media company, Joel Osteen built something extraordinary. But that success also raised a question that has followed him for years. Is this a ministry, or is it a business that happens to be run out of a church? And that question became a lot louder once people started looking closely at the theology behind the smile. Osteen is one of the most visible faces of what's called the prosperity gospel, a strand of Christian teaching that says God wants believers to be wealthy, healthy, and successful, and that speaking positive words and having strong faith can unlock those blessings. It's an appealing message. It tells people that they aren't broken, that they deserve good things, and that better days are coming if they simply believe hard enough. Fans have said his sermons pulled them out of some of the darkest periods of their lives. But plenty of respected theologians have pushed back hard on this framework. Some have gone so far as to call the prosperity gospel a distortion of traditional Christian teaching, arguing that it turns faith into something closer to a self-help philosophy than a call to sacrifice, repentance, or humility. Critics point out that Osteen rarely talks about sin, rarely mentions hell, and keeps his references to Jesus surprisingly brief for a man who leads one of the largest churches in the country. His sermons run about 27 minutes, timed precisely to fit into a television broadcast slot, and he delivers them from memory without notes, more like a rehearsed motivational speech than a traditional homily. Some pastors have said this style blurs the line between preaching and entertainment. Others have coined the phrase, cotton candy gospel, to describe it, sweet, easy to swallow, but without much nutritional substance underneath. There's a deeper concern buried in that criticism too. If the message is that faith equals prosperity, what does that imply about people who are struggling, who are sick, or who are poor? Critics argue that the flip side of a health and wealth gospel is an uncomfortable one. If you didn't get the blessing, maybe you just didn't believe hard enough. That idea troubles a lot of people, both inside and outside the Christian world, because it can end up blaming people for their own hardship instead of offering them comfort. And it's hard to separate that theological debate from Osteen's personal financial picture. He has said publicly that he hasn't taken a salary from Lakewood since 2004, and that his estimated net worth, somewhere between $50 and $100 million, comes from book royalties and speaking fees rather than church funds. He lives in a home in Houston valued at roughly $10.5 million, along with another property worth around $3 million. To his supporters, that's proof that his message works and that God rewards generosity and faith. To his critics, it raises an obvious question: if the gospel he preaches is genuinely about helping everyday people, why does the person delivering it live like that, while the church he leads reportedly spends only a small single-digit percentage of its budget on charitable outreach and missions? That financial picture became impossible to ignore in the spring of 2020, when the COVID-19 pandemic shut down churches, businesses, and just about everything else across the country. The federal government rolled out the Paycheck Protection Program, a package of loans designed to help small businesses keep their employees on payroll during the shutdown, with the promise that the loans would be forgiven if the money was used correctly. Lakewood Church initially said it wouldn't apply, believing the shutdown would only last a few weeks. But as the closures dragged on, the church changed course and, in late July 2020, received a loan of roughly $4.4 million through the program. Lakewood said the money went entirely toward maintaining paychecks and health benefits for its approximately 350 to 370 employees, and that none of it went to Joel or Victoria Osteen personally. Even so, the backlash was immediate and fierce. Osteen's name started trending online alongside pointed questions about why a church with a reported $90 million annual budget, run by a pastor with a personal net worth estimated in the tens of millions, needed a taxpayer-funded loan meant to rescue struggling small businesses. Groups focused on the separation of church and state argued that because the loans were essentially convertible into grants if certain conditions were met, accepting one amounted to the public funding a religious institution, which they said crossed a constitutional line. Under mounting public pressure, Lakewood repaid the entire $4.4 million in full by the fall of 2021. The church insisted it had always intended to pay the money back and that it had simply used it as a genuine bridge loan during an unprecedented crisis. But by then, the damage to Osteen's public image had already been done. For a lot of people who had never paid close attention to Lakewood's finances before, this was the moment they started asking harder questions about where all that money actually goes. And the truth is, it's genuinely hard for outsiders to get a clear answer to that question, because churches in the United States are not required to file the same financial disclosures with the IRS that other tax-exempt charities have to file. That means a megachurch pulling in tens of millions of dollars a year can operate almost entirely outside public financial scrutiny. Some ministries choose to release voluntary reports anyway, and when Lakewood has done so, the numbers have not always looked great to outside observers. Public reporting on the church's budget has suggested that a very small share, often cited as somewhere around 1% of total spending, goes toward missions and charitable outreach, while tens of millions of dollars each year go toward television production, weekly services, and administrative costs. Supporters argue that running a media operation reaching millions of people every week is inherently expensive, and that the size of the broadcast budget reflects the scale of the ministry's reach, not a lack of generosity. Critics counter that a church built primarily around outreach and charity should show it in the numbers, and that when the numbers lean this heavily toward production costs and administration, it starts to look less like a ministry and more like a media company with a religious brand attached to it. That tension between image and substance came into sharp focus during one of the worst natural disasters in recent Houston history. In August 2017, Hurricane Harvey slammed into the Houston area, dumping so much rain that streets turned into rivers and tens of thousands of people were displaced from their homes almost overnight. Lakewood Church, sitting in a 16,000-seat arena built to withstand extreme weather, was one of the few buildings in the city large enough to shelter a serious number of people. But in the early days of the storm, the church did not open its doors. Lakewood posted online that the building was inaccessible due to flooding in the surrounding area. Almost immediately, Houston residents began sharing photos and videos showing that the roads around the church appeared dry, contradicting that explanation. A hashtag calling for the church to open spread rapidly across social media, and the criticism grew loud enough that even national celebrities weighed in, arguing that a church with Lakewood's resources had no excuse for turning away people in need during a crisis. Osteen and the church stayed largely quiet for the first few days. Eventually, under continued public pressure, Lakewood did open its doors to shelter storm victims, and later years actually saw the church distribute food, water, and supplies during subsequent storms. But for many people, the initial silence and the disputed excuse left a permanent mark. It became one of the defining images people bring up whenever Osteen's critics want to make the point that his ministry talks a lot about generosity but doesn't always show up first when it's needed most. It wasn't the only incident that raised uncomfortable questions about how the church handles its responsibilities to the people who walk through its doors. Back in 2014, a family attending a service at Lakewood said that a church usher grabbed their 18-month-old baby's car seat off a pew and tossed it aside, causing the infant to fall forward. The family said the experience left them traumatized enough that they eventually left the state. Lakewood initially denied any wrongdoing, but the church ultimately agreed to pay the family $15,000 to settle the matter, while continuing to claim a legal protection sometimes called charitable immunity that limits liability for nonprofit organizations. The dollar amount was small in the context of a $90 million annual budget, but the incident added to a growing perception that a church operating at this scale was struggling to properly protect the very people who came to worship there. That concern about safety became something far more serious and far more painful on February 11, 2024. During the start of a Spanish-language service, a 36-year-old woman named Janess Yvonne Moreno arrived at Lakewood Church wearing a trench coat that concealed an AR-15 style rifle, carrying a backpack with a second rifle inside, and bringing her 7-year-old son with her. She threatened an unarmed security guard to get through the door, told people she needed help, and then opened fire in a hallway near the west side of the building, wounding a 47-year-old man. Two off-duty law enforcement officers who were working security at the church exchanged gunfire with her, and within minutes she was shot and killed. In the chaos of that exchange, her young son was shot in the head. He underwent multiple emergency surgeries over the following weeks, including procedures on his brain, and remained in critical condition for an extended period before slowly beginning to recover. A 57-year-old bystander was also shot but survived and was released from the hospital shortly afterward. In the days that followed, investigators pieced together a troubling picture of the shooter. Moreno had a documented history of severe mental illness, including schizophrenia, according to her former mother-in-law, along with a criminal record that included prior arrests. She had legally purchased the rifle just a couple of months before the shooting, despite Texas having no red flag law that might have flagged her history and prevented that purchase. Investigators later found anti-Semitic writings connected to her, along with a sticker referencing Palestine on one of her weapons, and reported that she had made comments online praising extremist figures. Her former mother-in-law said she had tried for years to get help from Moreno and had even attempted, unsuccessfully, to gain legal custody of the child to keep him safe. In the aftermath, Osteen addressed his congregation with a message centered on faith and resilience, encouraging people not to lose hope, and saying he was praying for everyone affected, including the shooter herself. For some in his congregation, that message brought real comfort during an unbearable moment. But others, including some of the victim's own family, felt the response sidestepped harder questions that the tragedy raised. Questions about gun access, about the state of mental health care, and about whether a church attracting tens of thousands of people every week had done enough to protect them, given that a single armed individual had been able to talk her way past security with a child in tow. The investigation into the shooting continued for roughly a year, eventually landing in front of a grand jury in early 2025 to determine what, if anything, should happen next regarding the broader circumstances around it. Taken together, these episodes have chipped away at something that used to feel unshakable about Joel Osteen's public image. For most of the 2000s and 2010s, he was almost untouchable, a preacher whose warmth and optimism made him one of the most recognized religious figures in the world, appearing comfortably alongside talk show hosts and pop culture figures in a way almost no other pastor could match. Now, every new headline seems to chip away a little more at that reputation. A federal loan controversy during a pandemic. A hurricane response that many Houstonians still haven't forgotten. A years-old lawsuit over a baby's car seat. A mass shooting inside the very walls he preaches from every Sunday. None of these stories on their own would necessarily define a ministry this large. But stacked together, they've created a narrative that Osteen's critics have been eager to point to, a picture of an operation that has scaled up its media reach and its wealth far more successfully than it has scaled up its accountability, its transparency, and its ability to keep people safe. Layer on top of all of that a demographic problem that has nothing to do with Osteen personally, and the picture gets even more complicated. Church attendance across the United States has been declining for years, but the drop-off is especially steep among younger generations. Surveys have consistently found that only around 15 to 16% of millennials and members of Generation Z attend church regularly, numbers that represent some of the lowest levels of religious participation ever recorded in the country's history. Younger Americans, broadly speaking, say they're looking for something different from organized religion than what earlier generations wanted, less emphasis on large buildings and polished production, more emphasis on genuine community, hands-on service, and spiritual honesty that doesn't feel scripted. That shift poses a real long-term challenge for a ministry built almost entirely around scale, media reach, and a feel-good message delivered from an arena stage. The exact model that made Lakewood the biggest church in America in the 2000s, huge crowds, national broadcasts, a polished, camera-ready pastor, may be increasingly out of step with what a new generation of believers is actually looking for. So where does that leave Joel Osteen today? He is still, by almost any measure, one of the most successful religious figures in modern American history. Lakewood Church still draws tens of thousands of people every single week. His books still sell. His social media following still numbers in the tens of millions. None of the controversies discussed here have driven him off the stage, and it would be inaccurate to suggest his ministry is on the verge of collapsing. But the cracks in the story are visible now in a way they simply weren't a decade ago. The loan controversy showed how quickly public opinion can turn against a wealthy ministry during a moment of national crisis. The hurricane response became a symbol that his critics still bring up more than 5 years later. The 2024 shooting exposed real vulnerabilities in how a megachurch of that size manages security for the people who trust it every week. And the long-term decline in youth church attendance suggests that even if Osteen weathers every one of these individual storms, the broader model he built his career on may simply be aging out with the audience that made it so successful in the first place. Joel Osteen built something that very few religious leaders in American history have ever managed to build, a media empire wrapped around a message of hope that reached tens of millions of people who might never have set foot inside a traditional church. That accomplishment is real, and dismissing it entirely would be unfair to the millions of people who say his words genuinely helped them through difficult chapters of their lives. But accomplishments this large also come with scrutiny this large, and in recent years, that scrutiny has landed on some genuinely uncomfortable questions, about where the money actually goes, about how the church responds when people need it most, about how safe its own building really is, and about whether the entire prosperity-driven, broadcast-first model can survive as the generation watching it grows increasingly skeptical of exactly that kind of ministry. Whatever you think of Joel Osteen, the smile on the stage and the story behind it are clearly two very different things right now, and for the first time in a long time, it's genuinely unclear which one is going to define his legacy. If you found this breakdown interesting, let us know in the comments what you think is really going on behind the scenes at Lakewood, and subscribe for more deep dives into the stories behind the biggest names in faith and media.